Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Plex interview. I'm producer Dave, and I'm joined by Michael Marshall, Vice President of the Merseyside Skeptics and host of Skeptics with a K, or co-host of Skeptics with a K, and also host of one of my favorite shows, Be Reasonable. How you doing, Michael?
Yeah, I'm great, thank you. Yeah, great to be here. Great to be on the show and chat.
Yeah, I thought it would be fun to talk to you because we cover some of the same topics. I've noticed that you've discussed chemtrails, flat Earth. You've talked with sort of what I would call garden variety religious nutters and religious, I would almost call them cult leaders. And I've noticed that what I noticed first about your show is that you seem to be the most patient man that has ever walked the planet, man or woman, actually. Is that in your nature, or is that something you had to learn as part of doing the Be Reasonable?
That's a good question. I think I'm not sure if it's necessarily part of my nature, or maybe it wasn't part of my nature when I first got involved in skepticism, maybe 10 years ago, something like that. Because I started in skepticism the way that lots of people do. You suddenly find that there's this whole world out there that is annoyed about the same things you're annoyed about and cares about the same kind of things that you care about when you always thought you were alone. And so I threw myself into everything, and I was the most kind of, for want of a better word, evangelical skeptic you could imagine for the first couple of years. But I think when it came to Be Reasonable, I was on a show before that called Righteous Indignation, where it was just, we do reviews of skeptical news and whatever's in the newspapers and things. But we started interviewing people who had alternative points of view, just because there were a million shows out there where you could hear what Steve Novella thinks, or what this leading skeptic over there thinks, what this leading skeptic over here thinks. But there weren't really any shows that listen to people we disagree with and actually hear those arguments firsthand. So I guess the patience kind of aspect is twofold, really. One is I actually want the person I'm talking to think that I'm a nice person. I don't need to call them an idiot. I don't need to shout or yell or anything like that, because I kind of trust my listeners to be able to recognize crap when they hear it. So I don't feel I need to be the one jumping down people's throats and saying that's nonsense. And the other side of it is, I think if I'm polite and good-natured, I'm more likely to get more interesting things out of them. So they won't just, if you attack someone, if you are very antagonistic towards them, they'll respond the way they always respond whenever anybody they've encountered reacts to them in that way. And if they've got pretty objectionable views, they meet people pretty often who'll disagree with them in pretty strident and sort of aggressively toned arguments. So that's kind of their comfort area, really, is to defend their point of view from an offence in that kind of way. So I always think that if you can be interested, if you can be polite, if you can be asking questions and stay interpersonal whilst also having a level of intellectual rigor, I think you either disarm people because they're not expecting the nice person that they're talking to be disagreeing with them and to be asking challenging questions they might not be expecting to hear. But you don't trade any kudos, or not kudos, but any of the rapport that you've built up. Once you've built up a rapport, you can get away with so much more when it comes to challenging questions if the person is warm towards you in the conversation you're having. That's not to say that some of the conversations in Be Reasonable, the person hasn't been particularly warm to me, but I think even in those ones, my politeness tends to be defiance, because I know it'll annoy them more than anything else. If they get very angry and aggressive towards me and I respond back with a relative calm, that's just going to infuriate them more. So I figure I can't lose so long as I retain my cool and my politeness and calmness. I can't come out of the show a loser, really.
That's stunning, because I've kind of tried that a couple times. Like, personally, I don't know, I can't always hold it together when I've talked to people who have views that are, I guess, factually incorrect. But the one that gets me is, a lot of times, and maybe you've noticed this too, although I haven't heard a lot of it from your guests, is when you get into the conspiracy minded people, or possibly like religious fundamentalists, you encounter, in some cases, a lot of bigotry. It's either like this sort of soft dog whistle bigotry against Jewish people, which is like basically a third of what's going on in conspiracy movements.
Yeah.
Or if it's like a person who's more religiously fundamentalist, maybe they don't like gay people, or they don't like transsexual people, they don't like people of other religions. I don't hear your guests doing a lot of that. Is that maybe, have you edited those things out, or is it just something you haven't encountered a lot of in your interviewing these people?
Well, I don't think I've ever edited the show. I think I've only ever edited 2 episodes of the show. One was when one of our guests made a allegation about somebody that we knew that if we put that allegation out, we were responsible for publishing it. And it was nothing to do with the conversation we were having. They just literally, apropos of nothing, said something quite not only distasteful, but a criminal allegation against somebody who was nothing at all to do with what we were talking about. And so we dipped that out because there was no point us publishing a criminal allegation that we'd have to then stand by. There was no point to that. And the only other time I've ever edited the show was when I spoke to the guy who still to this day pickets outside of abortion clinics, handing the mothers who are going in there to have an abortion, handing them baby clothes in order to convince them that they shouldn't have an abortion. And I asked him what was the biblical support for this fundamentalist Christian position he was taking against abortion. And I expected him to list several different verses of the Bible that I'd looked up ahead of time, the ones that typically come up. And what I got instead was about a minute and a half of him scrambling around his desk for pieces of paper that, oh yeah, my brother wrote some stuff down for me somewhere around here, and there's a minute of him scrambling around finding a piece of paper. And I took that out because it made him sound too bad. And I think that's the only other edit I've ever done to the show, because one of the things I tell my guests is, this is going to go out unedited, so I'm never going to cut out part of your argument. So at the end, you can say, well, I actually made a lot more sense in that, but he's edited it in a way to make it sound like I wasn't very coherent, or that I've said something important, or that I've bested him in this particular argument over here, and the host cut it out. So we never, by and large, edit the show ever, really. When it comes to the bigotry, I mean, it is in there. So I had an interview with a chap called Leo Rebello. I don't know if you ever heard that one. He was the Indian naturopath and homeopath. And that was the most naked anti-Semitism and homophobia that I've encountered in any other human being. He was an AIDS denialist who believes that HIV isn't a virus. It's not caused by a virus because viruses are too small to affect the human body. It's actually caused by fecal matter entering the penis during anal sex, and that's what causes AIDS. So maybe you didn't hear that one, but that was pretty strongly homophobic, and there's a lot of pretty strong anti-Semitism in there too.
I might go back and listen to that one. I haven't listened to all of the episodes of your show. There's just so many great podcasts out there. And I caught onto your show, I don't know, maybe a year ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, the Leo Rebello one is, it was a classic of the genre, if I can say that, because I still now get lots of messages about that particular show. And it's a perfect example of he was being more and more aggressive to me. So I became steadfastly more polite and calm in the face of that. And that wound him up even more. And what was fascinating is at the end of the interview, when we published it, I can only assume that he thinks, because he had the most time talking and because he was the one who was the loudest and was the more bombastic in the conversation, that he'd come across as the winner, the dominant one, because he dominated the conversation. And then he was really shocked that the comments on the blog post that it went up in were completely against him, because he said these awful homophobic and anti-Semitic things. And so he started arguing back to the people in the comments, and the comment thread just goes on for hundreds of comments. And he started inventing sock puppets to confirm how right he was. So they were agreeing with him. And then he got confused as to which account was which. And one of the sock puppets agreed with itself and quoted itself. And it was all very, very unedifying, I think, for him. So yeah, that's one worth looking up. It's a fun one.
You know, I find that when I've talked to a lot of these, a lot of conspiracy-minded or religious fundamentalist people, they don't really understand technology as well as they might think they do. Because, for example, if somebody was in the comment section on my website making sock puppets, I have their IP address.
Yeah.
It's not, this isn't rocket science. It's in the logs. I mean, I'm on Squarespace. I'm not like, it's not some kind of, high security super hacker website thing. It's for the masses, but I can still determine that somebody created fake accounts to agree with themselves in the comments if they were to do that. This is, it boggles my mind that people are going to, engage what I've started calling it the war of bad ideas, and not understand the fundamental, like even the baseline understanding of the technology they're using. It's a little bit odd.
Yeah, well, it was. Well, this was even better than that, funnily enough, because one of the things that there was on the website was just the first time you comment, it gives it to us to approve. And then once you've had a few comments through, your comments are automatically approved. So he left a comment, and we hadn't had time to approve yet because it was in the middle of the night. But he then, when he was logged in as himself, he could see his comment. He logged out and logged in as a sock puppet, and his comment disappeared. So his sock puppet started quoting the comment and saying that we deleted it. And he had a long back and forth with himself about how we were deleting comments. And they were all just there ready to be approved when we woke up the next morning, because he was in India and on a completely different time zone to us. So, it was pretty obvious what was going on, really.
Well, that's a fun story. Yeah. I don't know, like if I, for example, if I went on your show and maybe it was a bad look because I had some belief that you wanted to challenge, and I went onto your site and noticed that people were agreeing with you and not me, I would not be in a big hurry to make it worse by opening my mouth in your comment thread. I understand how that works, right? When you enter someone else's space and you just looked bad through whatever means you've just looked bad, the odds are that you're going to make it worse if you start arguing with the people in the comments on it. It's just not like a really wise tactic.
Yeah, that's true. Although what I would say is, I mean, most of the time, the times I get involved in the comment thread is on the side of the guest, if I ever feel like people aren't being charitable enough to the guest. Because what I really, really don't want is for me to have a 45-minute conversation with a guest who I disagree with, who I have a reasonable disagree with. We have a reasonable conversation. They don't convince me. I might poke a few holes in some of their arguments or highlight a few things that I think don't make sense. But we end it on reasonably pleasant terms, and then we post it, and then I get some of my listeners. It's not many of my listeners, but occasionally if a show takes off or gets outside of the circle of listeners that listen every week, you'll get comments from people saying, "Oh, what an idiot, what a gullible fool this person is." And that's the only times that I'll sort of come in and say, "Could you be respectful to my guests, because they've given up their time." And some of the guests come on because I think I get the sense that they think they can, if not convert me, then demonstrate that I'm wrong. And so there's maybe a level of bombast there. But other guests come on because they just want to talk about what they believe in, and they've been asked to come on a show, and they don't get paid to come on. They do it, they give a little of their time up, and I'd hate to see the listeners who I trust to listen to their arguments and to understand why their arguments are bad, then coming in and insulting them when the show's not really about that. So the few times that I get involved is sometimes to say to listeners, could we just remember to be respectful to the guest? We can criticize their ideas, but let's remember they're human beings, and they were taking part in this in their own time.
One listen to your show would indicate to me that I shouldn't go troll the comments on your show.
Yeah.
I'm not a troll. I am a troll. They put lists out of people who make fun of, for example, chemtrail believers, and I'm on every one of those lists. But I noticed that you had a couple different people on your show who believe in chemtrails. I heard the one with Lee Piercy. I didn't hear the one with Harry Rhodes. And it wouldn't occur to me to go into the comment threads and light Lee Piercy on fire, even though I obviously don't take his position on chemtrails. I don't believe in it. But the way and the tone of your show would indicate to me that if I'm going to go in there, the only thing I might do is go, maybe mention where I thought you could have done better, or where I didn't understand what the guest was saying, or maybe add some information that, because when you're doing an interview, you're not sitting there doing research the whole time during the interview. It makes for a really, really bad interview. You're not paying attention to the person talking to you. But it wouldn't occur to me to go in there and start trolling, or just even being slightly rude because of the tone of your show. I think there's a lot of ways in which being polite is getting a worse and worse rap in today's day and age.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, I actually think the majority of people are pretty good. I think the majority of people involved in skepticism are respectful, and they think about things the right kind of way. They're looking for, they're on the same side. They just want to make things better. I do think as a movement, there are people who are involved for not necessarily the best of reasons. I think that inevitably, and we see this with atheism too, you get some people who are in an atheist movement because they are appalled at the abuses of organized religion, or that they are unconvinced by the apologetics of religious fundamentalists. And you also get some people who want to tell Christians they're idiots, and who want to guffaw, and who want to own the religtards, or whatever they want to call them. And I think that is an element that's there. And I think I disagree with that element about as strongly as I disagree with the religion they're criticizing. Because I think one of the things I often say is that it's possible to have all the right answers and still lose an argument and still be wrong in the argument if you've got all the right answers and you come across as the arsehole there. You haven't succeeded, because if you've already got the truth on your side, you kind of have an obligation to try and spread that in a way that's going to bring more people to the truth, rather than to alienate people because they don't share your view, and you therefore look down on them because of it. So the majority, I would say the overwhelming majority of my listeners get that, and they really understand what the show's about. Just every now and again, a show will pierce the bubble of its hardcore listenership and blow up a little bit and attract people who are just hearing a really sometimes pretty crazy argument and want to point out that it's crazy. So I always try and discourage that kind of thing, and I think I try and discourage that as much as possible across skeptical discourse. We need to understand the arena in which these conversations are taking place. We aren't taking place in a vacuum. There are people who could be, for one thing, there's people who could be looking in on these conversations, and if they say that you're saying the right things, but you're coming across like an absolute arrogant arsehole, they're not going to think you're the right person in this conversation. And even if there's nobody listening, the person you're talking to is a human being, and if you lose nothing by affording them some respect. Even if they are utterly disrespectful to you, you lose nothing by being respectful to them.
Yeah, I think that's where the part that where you just said where they're utterly disrespectful to you is where I think that you and I may part ways in our rhetorical style. Because so people for maybe because there's going to be some people who aren't familiar with what we do here, because we have this wonderful guest, Michael from the Merseyside Skeptics here. We have a live call-in show every Sunday, and for the first hour, the phones are open. The second hour, we kind of cover the news and kind of goof on people like Pat Robertson. It's really the low-hanging fruit. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. But we like to think we're funny. And then after that, the show's technically over. But then we do this thing called Red Light, where the phone lines are open, and that's when we don't cover conspiracy theory so much as the personalities in the conspiracy movement, if that makes sense. We're almost like the National Enquirer for conspiracy theory in a way. It's like almost like a morning zoo format at night. And when people call in, they're afforded respect by the panel, but as soon as they start accusing us of being like shills for the NSA, or if they just call in to yell at us because we had pulled clips of them specifically, and they're just mad that we have done that, then that's, I think, where you and I are going to part ways. As soon as they start insulting us, we're not just going to be like, oh, you're an idiot, you're stupid, you believe in this because you're stupid, but we are going to a little more aggressively defend ourselves if they have been rude to us. And it's a difference in format, and I think it's also just a difference in tone. Our show is advertised in such a way that it's kind of obvious where we're coming from. So, and the fact that it's live, like, we don't have time to prepare for the caller, you know?
Yeah, you don't know who exactly is coming. I mean, I must admit, there are times that people will, if an argument is particularly woolly, or if it's expressed in a way that is particularly condescending, and there are times in the show, I'm not entirely proud of them, I'm a little bit happy with them, where I'll throw in a slightly sarcastic aside that I know is just at the tone that the guest won't necessarily get, but the audience will. So there's a couple of lines in quite a number of shows that the guest doesn't realize what I was actually saying, but the audience pick up and go, okay, that was a pretty snarky line there, and I got that one. So that's the closest I get to not necessarily even ridicule or rudeness, but lowering the tone from the lofty idealism of entirely polite debate at all costs. But I do enjoy those lines occasionally, but I never go to them for someone who hasn't first kind of traded all their chips in with their tone or their argumentative style, really.
Yeah, that we call that one toss. It's called tossing it over their head, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The problem is if that goes wrong and they catch it, you, especially considering the way that your show is branded and advertised, if somebody catches that, I understand why you're not necessarily proud of it because of the tone of your show. If somebody does catch that, then the whole thing could go sideways.
Yeah, and fortunately, I'd say fortunately it's never happened. I think it's probably because those comments are so few and far between, generally speaking, that I tend to only bring them out when I think it's maybe my release valve. It's the only way. It's the way that when everything is getting a little bit odd, or the kind of moments that the listeners start shouting at the radio, and I can't do that mid-interview, I'll vent through mild sarcasm instead. But they're relatively few and far between.
Besides that, the escape valve of snark, how do you handle it when someone starts to frustrate you? Because I know that it must happen, that you start to get frustrated with somebody. Maybe they're repeating themselves. They're not. Well, probably that they're repeating themselves, or that they're maybe assuming bad faith on your part when you have, you obviously probably come to these in good faith. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to keep doing it this long. How do you handle in real time the frustration?
Well, that's a good question, really. So I don't think I get that frustrated that often. The only time I think I get particularly frustrated, and it's only happened on a couple of interviews, is where I get the sense that the person I'm speaking to is either deliberately abusing a reasonable point to launder a very, very ugly point. An illustration, there was a chap I spoke to who ran a political party in the UK. It was the only explicitly anti-feminist party running in the general election a couple of elections ago. And the name of the party was Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. And it was an anti-feminist party. They had their 12-point anti-feminist manifesto. And there were many points in the conversation where the guy I was talking to, Mike Buchanan, would bring up a point that was actually a very important point. So the incidence of young men leaving leaving school without an education, or the number of men who commit suicide being awfully high, which is a genuine concern in society and something that is genuinely something we should be striving to try and fix. And he'd use that point to point out that this is because there is a feminist conspiracy designed to keep men in their place. And the reason men commit suicide is because the feminists want them to commit suicide and drive them to suicide. It was that kind of point that he was making. And those are the things that were frustrating me, because the point that you're raising, that you're pegging this on, is a very good point that we should be caring about. But the way that you're using that point demonstrates that you don't actually give a shit about the real factors at play. You just wanted to prop up your ideology, and that's so disingenuous that was starting to frustrate me. And I think I think you can hear that in my tone of voice, or probably the speed at which I was speaking probably accelerated as I tried to sort of get through thoughts a little bit quicker. But otherwise, generally, what happens when there's any moments of frustration, I try and just remember that if I'm frustrated, my listeners will be more frustrated. And if I lose my cool, we'll never resolve that frustration. We'll never get to a point where there's any satisfactory sort of conclusion or a satisfactory payoff to that. So I try and kind of keep myself composed, knowing that the listeners are going to hear where this is going. And if I can keep it together, we'll get this to somewhere that might be useful for that frustration for all the listeners. Or occasionally, like on the Leo Ribello one, where people would think I'd be incredibly frustrated because he's throwing out all sorts of aggressive insults towards me and shouting over the top of me and all sorts, and people would think I'd be very frustrated in it. But I spent the whole time thinking, just carry on, mate. This is great radio. You can interrupt me, you can shout, you can be as aggressive as you like, because you don't realize that the bounds that the discourse here isn't bound by this conversation. It's not when the Skype call hangs up, that's it, done. Everything we're saying is going to be then put in front of an audience who can listen to it in its entirety and judge things from there. So the worse you make yourself look, the less work I need to do if you are a bad actor who's making bad faith arguments and is very aggressive. I don't need to even ask probing questions if that's who you are, and that's what we're trying to do is uncover whether that's the kind of person you are or whether you believe what you're talking about. If you're doing all that work for me, I can just sit back and I'm not going to get frustrated because I can see the trajectory of this and I can see how it's going to be received by the audience. So trying to keep a broader view of where this conversation is going and what context it's in helps me avoid frustration too.
When you brought up the what we call men's rights activist who you had on your show, it occurred to me, and because of who you are, I decided to be polite and not cut in. I figured that would probably undermine all of the nice things I've said about you. That right there would probably have set me off, and it's just like everybody has like limitations to their character, and right there where what you were describing was that person was using the victim of, for example, suicide and the families almost as a pawn in their game to push their like kind of narrow ideology. Like you said, they don't give a shit about the victim of suicide and their family. It's just something they can blame on, insert my enemy here. And it's that right there. That's like your ability to just kind of let that kind of slide off your back while still acknowledging it. That's like, no, I would immediately be like, hold on, stop. I feel like I would start more polite. I'd be like, I feel like you're using the victims of this as a pawn or as something to put on display so that you can spread what you believe. And I don't think you care about them. And unfortunately, I think that you're correct in that the whole thing would probably go downhill from there. But the people who listen to what we're doing probably enjoy the part where it goes downhill a little bit because of the way we brand and the way that our audience has been built up.
Yeah. But I think there are different ways of doing that. So one of the things that I'm trying to think whether this is actually true or not. One of the things I aspire to, I guess, and sometimes I manage it in conversation, is to frame any objections I have, hopefully as questions and as kind of probing insights rather than as judgments. So it'd be very easy to say you're bringing up suicide victims just in order to forward this point that you're making. But that can take that sort of first tone of the offense that just then gets people's back up and they start defending themselves, and we just end up in this kind of loggerheads. Whereas what I try and do, and hopefully sometimes I'm successful, is to think in the moment of that's the point that I want to make, but how do I frame this in a more probing and collaborative way? And to say, okay, well, if your issue is suicide, what do you think is the solution? Because what you're proposing over here, is that going to really be the solution, or are there other solutions that would actually take precedent that don't involve the areas that you're worried about? And trying to sort of lead people through to asking questions themselves. And sometimes they flat out ignore those questions and carry on bashing me in exactly the way they were. But again, the listeners can hear that. But occasionally, when you frame these things as questions, you get people to a point that they've not necessarily considered before. And I think that's quite a valuable place to get to in a conversation, especially the conversations that I'm trying to have on the show, really.
That reminds me of a time that we were interviewing a gentleman named Wayne, who is a flat earther, and I was going to do the interview, but I had gone out and had a bit of a time the night before. And one of my former co-hosts, who's actually still a roommate of mine here, ended up taking the interview. And I'm glad he did, because he did more of what you describe. And by the end of the thing, he got the guy to explain that there are like reptilians from outer space hiding the fact that the Earth is flat. And I'm not sure that I would have gotten there with this guy, because I would have been, first of all, I mean, in the state that I was in, I certainly wouldn't have gotten there. I would have had about this much patience, but it's just not, my nature is such that I don't think it would have gotten there. And in the end, I'm really glad that Harrison, my roommate, took that one, because he was more patient, had gotten a better night's sleep, and he just kind of gave the guy enough rope to hang himself with the reptilian thing that was kind of the money shot at the end of the interview. And as a result, like it's been more, it was 2016. As a result, that's still one of the things on our site that gets the most traffic, and people listen all the way through it, because we live in the world where we have these wonderful metrics that tell us these things. And I'm just not sure that it would have gone the same way had I done it. So it's definitely differences in personality.
I mean, I had that with a recent interview. I don't know if you heard the Rodney Clough episode, the chap who's a hollow earther. He believes the Earth is completely hollow inside.
Oh my God, that guy was amazing.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, so I kind of don't, if for any listeners who haven't heard it, I kind of don't want to spoil where it went.
Oh, well, you don't have to. I'm going to put links and stuff to your show, in the show notes for this. And I certainly hope that my listeners will check it out, because your politeness will be a refreshing break from the, from the rapid fire panic attack of clips that we play during our show.
Yeah. but that one there, I mean, suffice to say, it went places beyond the Hollow Earth as a theory, and it went to places that I didn't think it would go, and I didn't think I'd actually get an interview with someone who went to those places. And that was just the ability to sort of follow each little thread and ask little challenging questions that were keeping a rapport going. And I think we had the rapport all the way through the interview, where, again, if I had been overly challenging or overly confrontational, I think I would have damaged that rapport. And I don't know necessarily that he would have been as willing to open up about the way the world actually works in his perception than if he felt like we were having a conversation. And one of the things I always say to people is, if you tell someone the reason that they're wrong, they will shut down. But if you ask someone, if you say, I want to believe what you believe, but when I try and think about it, I come to this hurdle. How do you get over that hurdle? Can you help me past that point? How do you get past that? Sometimes, first of all, people will be way more willing to talk to you because people like talking about the things they believe. When they don't think they're going to be having to defend every corner, when they're not having to be on their guard about the next attack that's coming, people like to talk about the way that they think and the way that they think the world works and their life and things like that. So you get a much more rich conversation out of it, because they're not always looking for the gotcha question. And sometimes when you point out there's this hurdle that you can't get over, they think, oh, that's great, I can get over that. And they get there and they think, oh, crap, I can't. I don't know how. I don't know that answer. I've never thought about this before. And sometimes in those conversations, when you kind of walk people around the maze of their beliefs, and they're walking with you, and you can when they're walking with you as receptively as they are, you can get them to take a left turn they've never taken before, and there's suddenly a brick wall there. And those can just be really joyous moments in a conversation, to think this person is now questioning something that they would probably never have questioned had we not had this conversation this way.
The last thing I want to get to, and I do want to thank you for your time. I'm going to try to keep this a little tight because it's late where you are, and I understand that you did an interview for your podcast before you talked to me.
Well, I didn't, unfortunately. I might be decent at interviewing, but I'm terrible at admin, and I just didn't quite get the details of it right, so the interview didn't go ahead after all. It's a good job it's only once a month that I have to do them.
I am a bit, we'll say colloquially, OCD about organization and making sure everything is exactly as it needs to be. Obviously don't think that I have a medical condition. It's just, the way we use that colloquially is a little bit different. So that's not a problem I have. Maybe if we were neighbors, I could help make sure your schedule's on point and you could do interviews for us so that we don't yell at people who say rude things to us. So before we get done here, one of the most impressive interviews that you did is going to be your episode 48 with Mr. Ed Turner. Mm. It's because there's a lot going on in that, what I'm going to call the social justice space right now in skepticism. There's a lot of disagreement between both prominent skeptics and people more like myself, who I guess I would say is more like a layman skeptic, or basically I'm just a talk show host. But I generally take your position on all of this. I think that a lot of it's overblown. I don't think that the problem is as big as what I think that it's that there are cases in which anybody of any kind of ideology is going to take things too far, go overboard. But what I try to think about when I see people, especially on college campuses, who everybody's like, oh, look, they're going overboard. Oh, look, they're acting crazy. I try to consider for a moment what my 20-year-old self would have done, where I would have been if I would be overreacting. And there's a way in which I think a lot of that is missing. The idea that it's people my age. I'm 40. It's people my age, or 41 now, actually, which is frightening. But it's people my age and older are really worked up about what 18 and 19-year-olds are doing. And I figure when I was 18 or 19, if I had pissed off somebody in their 40s or 50s, I'd have felt like it was a job well done. And so I think that there's just, and I don't think a lot of people, the guys at Cognitive Dissonance had a guest on to talk about this, and they did a really good job of talking about like what I'm going to go ahead and call is almost like a gap of empathy or a gap of understanding of what it's like to be a young person. And as I've grown up, like I DJ and like I'm involved with an event here called Bike Party, and I'm just always around people who are both older than me and younger than me. So I didn't like kind of stay with my friends from high school or kind of stay in the age group of people who were born between like, let's say 1975 and 1985. So I feel a little more connected to younger people. And I think that a lot of times it's just, there's some get off my lawn going on, if that makes sense. Yeah,
it does. And I think part of it is where are we hearing from these stories? So you see a story of a campus somewhere in America of one of the 4,000 universities or colleges or however many number there are. There's this one where there is this issue, and we know this is a major problem that these 18-year-olds were shouting at a professor, and we know this professor feels like they've had their free speech trampled on because we can see him on 24/7 on Fox News doing every single show talking about how his free speech was trampled on. And we think, and it just strikes me that you don't see those liberal 18-year-olds being invited on the Rolling News to explain their side of things. So even if their side is totally wrong and they really have trampled on this professor's free speech, what's the outcome of that? What's the possible harm that can come from this? What's the level of harm that can come? And it's very, very rarely the kind of power that the culture wars wants to ascribe to these 18, 19-year-olds. You know, they've said you can't wear this particular fancy dress costume. Okay, well, maybe that's a bit of an overreaction. Do we need to hear about it on the Rolling News and on 50 different blogs and on every conservative on Trump fan on Twitter pointing out that here's another example of PC gone mad to justify some of their other horrible views that they have? I just think that's what we're seeing is there is a network that thrives on these stories. So even if these stories are extreme edge cases, they get pushed to the front as if they're reflective, and then the bias of availability, the availability heuristic kicks in, where you think, well, are liberals going mad? I can remember that one story, and I saw that story everywhere, so it must have been big. So maybe that's definitely happening, and we just aren't seeing. I'd be astonished if there weren't at least as many terrible stories of conservative things conservative students are doing on campus, but there isn't a mechanism there isn't a news service that's fascinated and thriving and selling advertising space off the back of promoting those stories. So we're seeing a real difference in the amplification of these events, and they're playing into narratives that people have about all other aspects of society. I mean, I just don't think, the campus craziness thing, I don't think it's any different to it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago on university campuses. From talking to people who were at the university in the 90s, they say this is what it was always like because they're 18-year-olds, they're finding their way. Sometimes they'll hit on incredibly important social issues and be hugely effective for important social change. Sometimes they'll hit on something that is a bit exaggerated and not all that important and a bit self-important, and they'll ditch it in a couple of years when they grow up.
It's as if as you get older and you experience more things. Now, try to follow here, right? Because this is really complicated and counterintuitive. It's as if as you get older and experience more things, you get better at picking your battles.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I actually saw I sat in a conspiracy theory lecture. I can say actually, I sat in a David Icke lecture on Saturday night, and he went at length about free speech and campus craziness and LGBT, and he used a very, very long acronym of LGBTT, QQFG, BDSM, and it was all this very, very, and he was pointing out that this is a hugely ridiculous stream of letters that the liberals want us to live under. Everyone has to identify by each different part of this long stream of letters. And you look into where that specific stream of letters came from, and it came from one university in America. In their accommodation had one accommodation block that was for, if you're gender fluid, these are the kind of things you might be. If you're that, this is the one for you. If you are interested in African American history, Malcolm X house might be for you. If you're interested in farms, the farmhouse might be for you. It was just an ad for accommodation at one single university. But when I Googled that string of letters, that string of inclusivity, gender fluid letters, It appeared once on that university's website. It appeared once on a website that just explains lots of different abbreviations, and it appeared on 50 different conservative blogs pointing out how this is the new world that the liberals want you to live under, PC gone mad. It's just the amplification effect is, it doesn't matter what the source was, it matters what you can make the source into if it supports your point. It's exactly the same as the guy who's justifying his stance against feminism because he thinks feminism is causing men to commit suicide on purpose. That's the goal of feminism. He's using those suicide victims to forward his narrative, just as these other people are using this one particular ad out of context to support their narrative. There's a huge amount of that going on, and there's a whole infrastructure of interconnected blogs and radio shows and TV shows that thrive on making people think that this is the important threat to their freedom and their way of life, when really it's never going to affect them, and nor should it really.
I also feel like the term political correctness is getting a really horrible rap. I'm a gay man, and political correctness is the reason in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, that I was able to come out in high school.
Mm.
I don't know that that's the right word for it. We'll call it acceptance or more tolerance or more understanding of people who are different than you. But when I end up in those kinds of conversations, I don't just give up the ground that what we'll use, for lack of a better term, we'll call political correctness is bad. I don't give that ground up because I feel like, I don't know, I feel like it benefited me, and I feel like it's not just me.
But it benefits everybody. I'm a straight white guy, but political correctness benefits me because it means that I can have a more accepting, understanding view of the world around me and not be an arsehole to people who are in some way different to me because I have never been taught to think about anybody else's experience. I'm a more rounded person because I care about people who have a different experience of life than me. And that's kind of part of it, that I grew up in a place where people weren't politically correct. People were homophobic and racist, the small village I grew up in. And it's a very restrictive view of the world, to dislike the unknown, to fear the unknown, to hate the unknown. So I think it's got benefits to absolutely everyone. And the idea that political correctness has gone too far and gone mad and is the root of all evil was hack in the 1980s when comedians were doing bits about political correctness gone mad. It was hack back then, but it's somehow come back into force with a vengeance, this idea that it's all to do with political correctness. And again, so many of them, you see stories in the UK of, we're no longer allowed to sing Bar Bar Black Sheep at schools to children, a nursery rhyme, because of political correctness. And you look into where that story was, and it was a story in one tabloid about one school that got the wrong end of the stick and issued guidance around what nursery rhymes you might be able to say, and didn't mention political correctness, had nothing to do with the fact that you were using the word black, but it gets brought in as evidence and passed around the public consciousness to a point where that's the story that people tell as to why political correctness has gone mad. It's exactly the same thing of so many of these cases are out of context edge cases that are recontextualized, put into often a right-wing media framework that thrives on pushing this narrative, and then echoed to a point where it's been repeated so often people think it's true.
And it's almost like, it's really interesting. It's like, no, you're outraged. No, you're outraged. And it, for coming from the other side of this, from the side where I don't actually, like you were saying, political correctness, I feel like I don't like the term anymore either, but I do feel almost bound to talk about the term as if it's not toxic because of the way it's being talked about by other people, and just that it's what they're talking about. If you kind of peel away all of the outrage from it, actually does make the lives of regular people better. But you're talking about the edge cases. A lot of it doesn't make sense, and the outrage that is being ascribed to those of us who are too politically correct is actually being shown in a lot of ways by the people who are complaining about political correctness. They seem more outraged than I do, and I'm supposedly the politically correct one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of it is if you can label your opponent, and this happens in arguments too, and it's something I try and avoid and be reasonable. But if you can label your opponent as having got offended or outraged or upset or emotional, you can write them off as if they've lost. If you can do it first, you beat them to it. But really, some of the most emotionally charged, outrage stuff I've seen is from people who are saying, well, the libs, the libtards have gone crazy and its political correctness has gone mad, and just look at it's incredibly emotionally charged, but they wouldn't accept that because a lot of the people who make those kind of arguments believe that showing any kind of emotion that they any kind of emotion shows that you've lost the argument because you've lost the intellectual upper hand, as if their side isn't based on emotion too, as if a huge amount of their arguments are based on emotion, which they almost invariably are. But the easiest way to hide one of your flaws, whether you realize it's a flaw or not, is to accuse the other person of it first.
I'm not surprised that Fox and Breitbart are doing this, but sometime around 2010 or 2011, I started noticing what I've started calling rudely mixed skepticism. I've started noticing that political correctness has gone wild in what I've called mixed skepticism. I know it's rude to refer to it that way, but that's just the way it is. And Twitter is that format. I don't know if you're aware of something called Elevator Gate, but it seems to me like that was the original sin of all this. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say Elevator Gate?
Yeah. So I remember it. I remember it very well. I remember it very well.
So if anybody's listening to this and doesn't know what that is, I'll give a real quick rundown of it. A skeptic who used to be on the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, Rebecca Watson, was leaving a hotel bar late at night. I don't know exactly what time it was. It was at a conference, and we'll use the term gentleman joined her in the elevator, which is in fact a confined space, and then proceeded to hit on her. And don't hit on people in the elevator. Especially if you were just at the same bar they were at, maybe go talk to them at the bar, say hi. And then she went on her YouTube and sort of mentioned it. And instead of people going, oh, that really sucks, it's really like a shitty place to hit on people, you shouldn't hit on people in the elevator because they can't leave, people piled on her, acting like she had done something wrong by expressing that, hey, don't fucking hit on me in the elevator at the conferences. It's rude and it makes me uncomfortable. And to me, that's like where it all started. I don't know if that's where it all started. That's just where it first came up to me. And the response to it was kind of stunning to me. I know not to hit on people in the fucking elevator. They can't leave.
And I think there'll be lots of people who don't know that and would be, and to come across the idea that you shouldn't hit on people in elevators for the first time in a way that is suddenly part of a pitched battle, wrongly part of a pitched battle because people hugely overblew it all. People felt personally attacked by that, and I think part of it was, and we see with so many of these things, people want to justify their emotional response to something, whichever side of it they happen to be on. Although for me, there's a very clear right side of that is you don't hit on people in an elevator. It's not that hard a thing. But people want to justify their emotional response. And to do that, they take their understanding of what the other person said, which might not be the understanding or the intent that was meant. It might not even have been the intent that was there in the words. It was what they have read from it. So this is the worst possible view of the worst possible interpretation of the words that you've said. Here is my reaction to that, because if I can take the worst possible interpretation of what you said, it justifies the level of outrage or anger or emotional response that I have. So I think, again, so often people's reactions to things and people's reading of how things read are influenced first by their emotion, and then they rationalize that by saying, well, this is what the person meant here. So you can see something that somebody finds incredibly offensive, and there was without digging into yet another controversy and having this interview going for like 3 hours, there was the mythicist Milwaukee, where a chap from the UK who's a complete unknown basically in UK skepticism, he's got nothing to do with it. One of the things he had done was tweet a rape joke or a rape threat at an MP in the UK, saying that apropos nothing to her, basically saying to her, I wouldn't even rape you. That tweet gets read out on stage at Mythicist Milwaukee, and the audience cheer it as a brilliant stance for free speech. And the people defending it and that are saying, but why are you annoyed? He's saying he wouldn't rape her. So, well, he's saying he wouldn't even rape her, and the word even means something there. But you've elided through that word and said, well, I'm sure he just meant this or that, because you weren't personally offended by it, and you have to justify your interpretation of the words, or justify your emotional response to it by having a malleable interpretation of the words that may or may not be what the words actually mean. So I think we see that huge amount as people taking the worst interpretation of the things that the people they disagree with have said, and the best possible interpretation of the things that people they agree with have said, even if the things they've said have been really shitty, and then having these pitched battles based on a complete lack of middle ground, a complete lack of shared understanding of what words mean and what things been said actually mean. And I guess to take this full circle, that's kind of why in Be Reasonable we try and have conversations that are open and polite, and not jumping to the worst interpretation of something my guest says, but trying to understand what they mean behind it and understand how their mind is ticking and what their intent is, so we can actually see when we are appalled by something, when we were amused by something, when we're intrigued by something, is that a legitimate response? Is that a valid response? Are we actually understanding what we're reacting to first?
Fantastic. This has been an interview with Michael Marshall from the Merseyside Skeptics. You can find Merseyside Skeptics at merseysideskeptics.org.uk. If you don't know how to spell that, just punch it wrong into Google. Google will fix it for you. And you can find Be Reasonable at all the usual places, Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, etc., etc. Is there anything you wanted to say before we, to my troll-filled audience, before we close this out?
Well, I just hope people, if they haven't heard Be Reasonable before, I hope they check it out. I hope they find some interesting things in there. And check out the Leo Rebello episode. I promise you'll enjoy that. That's a blockbuster.
All right, this has been the Plex Interview. You can check out our big show every Sunday at 7 p.m. Pacific at echoplexmedia.com.